Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the topping Shenzhen Audio EX5 all-in-one DAC and headphone amplifier. This is a product that's been a collaboration apparently between Shenzhen Audio and Topping, but I also believe it might be an evolution of some of the existing range of Topping products. I'm not familiar enough with the older Topping products to say which one it is, but no doubt if you do some searching online, you'll quickly find conversations about whether this is an evolution of something like, say, a DX3 Pro, which is probably the sort of product that it has come from. As you'd expect given the collaboration, this has been sent to me by Shenzhen Audio for review, but there's no kickbacks or affiliates or anything like that. So I will put a link down below in case you're interested in the EX5, but there's no monetary interest from my part in whether or not you buy this or you don't. That will probably become pretty clear as well when I start to talk more about what I've heard in trying the EX5. Before we get into the details though, let's take a closer look. The EX5 retails for $350 US, which equates to about 475 Australian dollars. So for an all-in-one, if you think about the comparison price of an individual amp and DAC, for an all-in-one, it's pretty well priced. Of course, that also depends on whether it sounds any good, and we will get to that, but first let me talk about what's going on inside, what the features and functions are, all that sort of stuff, before we talk about how it sounds. The EX5 is built around two 9038Q2M Sabre DAC chips, and that allows it to provide a balanced output. It also means that it manages DSD through all of its inputs, and also has MQA if you're using USB. Now whether or not MQA is important to you, I'm going to leave that up to you, but this has it should you want it. It's essentially a plug and play device with Windows computers, but you can also download specific drivers that allow you to use up to 32-bit audio should you wish to. I haven't tried it with that, I don't think it's particularly necessary, and I try to avoid adding additional unnecessary drivers to my PC if possible, but it's there if you do wish to drive this to the absolute edges of its performance. Let's take a look now at the back and the front of the device to talk about the inputs, outputs, and I'll cover off things like preamp functionality and also the headphone amp stage while we're looking at the front and the back. And we might start with the back on this occasion. Looking at the back of the device, we've got the power socket and a power switch there. So that's your master power switch. You've then got a power switch on the front we'll get to shortly. We've then got a Bluetooth antenna and it will do LDAC. We've also got USB-B, we've got optical, coaxial, and then we've got our analog outputs, both RCA and XLR. One cool thing about the EX5 is it allows you to switch between which of these outputs you're using or send signals to both. So if you had, say, two different sets of active speakers, which I happen to, so I would have my studio monitors here for any mastering, mixing type work, and then I would have my music listening active speakers, which are a pair of B&O speakers running from the RCAs. And using a product like the EX5, I can control which gets sound when. That's a really nice feature. I don't know how many people are going to need it because not everybody is doing the sort of setup that I've got here, but it's nice to have the versatility should you be in a position to need it. Something else to mention while we're on the back here is that these are variable line outs only. So there's no fixed line out option from the EX5, it's all variable. If you turn it up to maximum volume though, it does produce an output that's on par with other similarly priced DACs, both in terms of quality but also in terms of volume output. So the back panel's pretty solid. We've got all of the major digital inputs plus Bluetooth, plus we've got these variable switchable outputs, so there's lots of versatility and power coming out of the back of the EX5. Now if we take a look at the front of it, we've got a very simple front panel, but I think a really nicely designed one. We've got a rotary control knob that's got a nice satisfying click. So it's got a really nice tactile feel as you move it, and that means it's also a digital volume control, which I love. So you've got perfect channel balance all the way through the frequency range. It's also pressable, so you can click it to switch the unit on and off, but it also means with single presses you can cycle through the inputs, and with a double press you can switch between the outputs. And I mentioned briefly before some of the output modes for the back, but just to give you an idea of exactly what there is, option 1 is the headphone outputs only. Option 2 is XLR only, option 3 RCA only, option 4 XLR and RCA, and then we come back around to the beginning, back to the headphone output. So it's a really nice control system there. I like interacting with this volume knob. I think it's a really, really nice control dial setup. The only drawback with it is it doesn't give you access to some of the other controls you might want. For example, gain is unavailable through the control knob, and also filters are unavailable through there. So you have to use the remote control if you want to change filters or you want to change gain. To provide a little bit of detail on both of those, there's 2 gain levels, low and high, and then there's also multiple filter options. And the good news is that as usual, they do make very slight changes to the presentation of the sound. So not so much the frequency response or anything like that, so much as the sense of space in the sound and the sense of attack on the transients or the leading edges of the individual notes. Something else that I really like about the EX5 is the display on the front. It's large, it's not too bright. I prefer the orange displays over things like blues and greens or the bright whites because it's a little bit more soothing and relaxing to look at depending on your environment. So all in all, we're heading in a really good direction here with everything stacking up very well on paper. Now let's talk a bit about the headphone amplifier though, because that's where things start to get interesting. The first thing to mention is we've got both XLR and 6.3mm outputs, so for balanced and single-ended respectively. And interestingly in the specs, both of these outputs provide 1.3 watts or 1300 milliwatts into a 32 ohm load. And that's really unusual that you've got a balanced output having the same power output levels as a single-ended output. It makes me wonder if it is a truly balanced headphone stage or if it's just one of those convenience connections having the XLR socket there. I haven't looked deeply into that to work out which is the truth, and it probably doesn't really matter because the reality is balanced and single-ended outputs, if implemented well, are both perfectly fine for headphones. I'll talk shortly about how they both sound because that to me further cements the fact that it doesn't really matter if one is balanced and one is single-ended or if they're both single-ended with just an XLR socket for convenience. Before we talk about the specific sound quality though, I want to talk about something that might draw me a little bit of hate here, so I apologise if what I'm about to say goes against your beliefs and your views of audio, but here we go anyway. The EX5 uses Topping's NFCA system, which is a nested feedback composite amplifier. What that means in layman's terms is it's using a complex feedback system very similar to the THX AAA technology in something like the 789 amplifier from Drop. It's using that sort of feedback system to keep the measurements of distortion very, very low. The problem is that process that's used here, it's used in Topping's other amps, it's used a similar version in the THX amps, that has a tendency to blunt the transients of music. The way these nested feedback systems work is great for producing measurements, but actually doesn't translate particularly well into musical sound quality. And as we transition now into talking about the sound quality from the headphone outputs of the EX5, I have to say I don't think it's doing any favours here. Listening to the balanced headphone output initially, I describe the sound from the EX5 as solid and decent for an all-in-one. The sound is definitely clean and neutral at first glance. But what I noticed as I listened to it was I never felt the energy of the music. No matter what volume level I had it at, I never got a sense of rhythm and excitement and engagement from the sound. And what I noticed as I started to listen more analytically to it is that the transients, the leading edges of notes, everything that should give the energy and the vibrance to the music was just somehow a little bit flat. It was like it was all a little bit blunted. I'll provide some specific examples shortly to explain what I mean, but for now what you need to know is that the sound from the balanced headphone output of the EX5 is just a little bit lacking in life. It's lacking in energy and it's lacking in attack. Tonally, everything's just where it should be, so in terms of the frequency range, there's no sense of emphasis or coloration, but the sound is just a little bit too kind of lifeless for my tastes. The soundstage from the EX5 is okay, it's not great but it's not bad, but in terms of within the soundstage, there's a lack of space around individual sounds and instruments. That results in a soundstage that does feel a bit compressed, a little bit claustrophobic at times. It's not too muddy, it's not too thick, but at the same time, I did feel like I just wanted everything to have a bit more space to breathe. After listening to the balanced headphone output for a while, I switched over to the 6.3 to see if it was the same or different. And to me, there was a significant difference in sound. The bass from the 6.3mm output is a little bit punchier and a little bit fuller. And I wondered if it was actually about the way the headphone amplifier stage is controlling the driver in the headphones. This was using mostly the Focal Utopias, and I felt like the driver was more free to move, was maybe not being controlled as tightly, but for me, it actually produced a more enjoyable sound. Things suddenly became a little bit less sterile, a little bit less cold, and whilst the blunting of transients was still there, it was a little bit less noticeable, and therefore the music had a sense of life and energy that the balanced output didn't give me. Having said that, the cost of this was a tighter soundstage still. There was probably the same amount of space around instruments, but it was almost like the soundstage became more of a triangular shape, and so it did mean that whilst the image was probably more tightly focused in some ways, and there was still a decent amount of space or a comparable amount of space to the balanced output, I did feel like things were very narrow in terms of the left-right width. So at this point in my review process, I have to say I wasn't particularly impressed with what I was hearing from the EX5. It wasn't bad, but it also, for me, was just lacking something. And so I wanted to see if it was my expectations being too high, because obviously I'm often listening to really high-end gear here. So were my expectations too high, or was it actually that the system used within the EX5 was causing the problems? To work that out, I split it apart to look at the DAC stage and the amp stage separately. Starting at the top of the source chain, I compared the DAC stage initially. So what I did for this was I ran an XLR output from the EX5 with the volume maxed out, so you're getting essentially a line level output. I ran that into the SH-8s amplifier from SMSL, and I also ran the same type of feed from the SU-8s from SMSL, which is their balanced DAC. I ran that also into the SH-8s, both of them via a switching box. So I now had the EX5 and the SU-8s driving through a switching box into the same balanced amplifier. What I heard when comparing the two were two DACs that are almost indistinguishable. I do believe there was just a very slight difference in sound, with the sound coming out of the EX5 being maybe just a tiny little bit thicker sounding than that from the SU-8s, but I wouldn't trust myself to pick them in a blind test. That's how close they are. And what that tells me is that the DAC stage in the EX5 is not the problem. In fact, I think the DAC stage in the EX5 is absolutely fantastic for the price you're paying. So having identified now that the DAC stage of the EX5 is not a problem, I wanted to hear just how the amplifier stage only compared against another headphone amp in a roughly similar price range. And again, I turned to the SMSL stack because it's got the most comparable balanced headphone amplifier at a relatively affordable price. I recognize that we're talking here about a single unit worth $350 compared to two individual units, both on their own worth about $300 to $350. So it's not exactly a fair comparison, but they're the nearest things I have that have similar feature sets. And I will provide a more budget comparison in a moment once we cover off the quality of the DAC and the amp. So talking now about the amplifier quality in the EX5, what I did was run the XLR outputs maxed out into the SH-8s amplifier from SMSL, and then I tested the headphone output from here and the headphone output from the SH-8s driven by the DAC in the EX5. And straight away, I heard all those same traits that I described earlier. The SH-8s had the qualities that I was missing from the EX5 before. When I listened to the EX5 through its own headphone amp, again the transients were blunted, the soundstage was compressed, everything just got lesser in quality. Whereas running the EX5 outputs into the SH-8s, I did hear what I was expecting to hear in the first place, which was a good level of budget quality, maybe slightly above budget quality sound, coming from the combo of the EX5 DAC and the SH-8s amplifier. So sadly for me, where that leaves us is that we've got a wonderful DAC stage here, paired up with what I think is a mediocre headphone stage. To put that further into context though, let me give you a couple of specific track examples that you can go and listen to for yourself. The first comparison is between the EX5 standing on its own up against the SMSL stack that I mentioned, so the SU-8s and the SH-8s. I was listening to Feel Again by One Republic for this test, and it was immediately evident to me that the SMSL stack was just producing a more organic and realistic type of sound. The EX5 sounded clinical, cold, and lifeless in comparison. Where the EX5 was lacking in space and ambience, the SMSL stack did it very comfortably. So the music had a sense of space around it, there was ambience to the track, and whilst it's not the biggest soundstage or the best resolution or anything like that, the SMSL stack was an enjoyable and engaging listen. Coming back to the EX5, any engagement, any enjoyment was really sucked out of it, which is disappointing. One final specific thing that I noticed was that the bass drums in the track were much better resolved in the SMSL stack. The bass notes from those drums via the SMSL stack had a sense of richness and resolution that the EX5 just couldn't keep up with. Now again, I'm recognizing the fact that we've got nearly a $700 stack going up against a $350 all-in-one, but I wanted to share with you what I think should be capable from an all-in-one type setup. There's no reason that the EX5 can't perform better than what it's doing, as I'll show you in a moment. The problem to me is the pursuit of these incredibly good measurements is getting in the way of the musical enjoyment. The nested feedback type circuits, I believe, just do something to the musical qualities that really take the fun out of it. But to help illustrate that, let me put this up against a lower level rival. For this comparison, I hooked up the Loxjie D30. I don't think the Loxjie D30 is available anymore due to the AKM fire because it was built on an AKM chip, but when it was available, it was a $179 all-in-one unit, just like the EX5 here. The key difference being that the D30 is single-ended only in terms of both the DAC outputs and the headphone outputs, but other than that, they're pretty comparable units. The D30 is also vastly less powerful than the EX5. So in theory, the EX5 being more expensive, having more DAC technology with the dual chips, being balanced, having more power, this should be way ahead of the D30. And the D30 is not an amazing device. As much as I love it, and I talked about how much I love it in my review, it has massive flaws. It's not a great sounding device overall, it's got a relatively weak headphone stage, both in terms of power, but also overall quality. It is a budget unit. And yet listening to Rock Dust Lightstar by Jamiroquai, using the EX5 and the D30, so EX5 I was using the balanced output, but it wouldn't have really mattered either way because the sound differences are pretty minimal between the two, even though there are slight differences. And of course using the D30 single-ended only because that's all it can do, in both cases driving the Utopia, the D30 was the far better listen. The image from the D30 was more holographic, and the transient response was back to what it should be from the D30. As I listened to the track further, what I found was that JK's voice was much better focused in the soundstage from the D30 compared to how it was with the EX5. And whilst the sound was a bit smoother overall from the D30, I found there was no less resolution. If anything, it's like there was a bit of top-end glare from the EX5, and that's not the first time I've found that with these types of high feedback reliant systems. Finally, if we talk about the soundstage, while the soundstage on the D30 was nothing to write home about, when I switched from the D30 back to the EX5, it was like everything pulled in and also flattened out. So all of the sounds were kind of trapped in this little band of sound in front of me, and therefore there was a lack of sense of space, there was a lack of separation between sounds, and also therefore it's harder to pick out individual parts of the music to focus on at any one time. So all in all, I'm actually pretty disappointed in the EX5. If you needed an all-in-one compact type DAC that you might occasionally use the headphone amplifier from, but it's more about having a DAC to drive, say, active speakers, then I think the EX5 might have a place. Having said that, I personally would much prefer to buy something like the SMSL SU-8s and then add on a compact little headphone amplifier like say a shit Magni and give that the headphone driving duties when you need it for those occasions that you have to have headphones. If you're looking for a quality headphone driving system that's not focused on active speakers, then I really don't think the EX5 is a good choice. I would personally much prefer, if it were me, to go out and buy myself a pair of compact stacked units, even like an E30 and L30 I'd probably choose rather than the EX5. So again, both topping devices, the E30 from topping being the DAC, the L30 being the amp, I would choose that setup over this because you can always swap out the headphone amplifier should you want to improve it in time. Yes, it doesn't give you balanced drive, but I really don't see a great deal of benefit coming from this in terms of the balanced drive. So as you probably already gathered, this is not a product I'm going to recommend. I'm really sorry to Shenzhen Audio that I can't provide better news on this collaboration product they put together with Topping, but for me, it just falls short in the headphone stage. If you're in the market for something like this, can I encourage you to go out and explore your options because I do think you can do better. For anyone that's already bought the EX5, I apologise if I've just said bad things about a brand new unit that you've just bought and want to love, but my recommendation would be that before you make up your mind either way, and certainly before you come on the channel and abuse me down in the comments, maybe grab yourself a cheap separate headphone amplifier, something like a shit Magni for example, plug it into this and listen to both and see for yourself. I recognise the measurements from this are stellar, but unfortunately the ongoing story continues that measurements don't always equate to sound quality. There are still some things we can't measure effectively, and those things tend to be in the areas such as transients, which is where the EX5 headphone stage does fall down. So apologies again to anyone who I've upset with this review. It's never my intention. I much prefer to say great things about products, but on this occasion I really can't. If this review's been useful to you, maybe it saved you $350, then please think about hitting the subscribe button and the like button. I've got some great new content coming up very, very soon. And so for now, I'll leave you to the music. Happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.